My name is Daniel Oney. I'm the Research Director at the Texas Real Estate Research Center at Texas A&M University. So in this article, I wanted to take a look at what the impact of law firm activity is on Texas office markets. Law firms are major users of office space. They take up more than 14 million square feet of office space in Texas. That's the equivalent of a 700-story building. They're also important because of their location. They tend to anchor major buildings in our downtowns, and that's had a little bit of a stabilizing effect on our office markets in this really difficult post-COVID era. So law firms are also growing at a pretty rapid rate in the state because of general growth in Texas. Law firm employment and law firm office space use tends to grow at the same rate that the overall market grows in our Texas metros. When we look at leasing activity for large law firms, there's some clear differences before and after COVID. For instance, all the major leases by law firms in Texas the 5 years before COVID compared to all the leases by those types of firms after COVID show us that there are far fewer leases. That's probably because many firms are in a wait-and-see mode. They don't want to renew or extend until they know what their workplace policies are going to be. They're leasing space for a much higher rent, and that reflects the fact that these firms are moving into the newest, highest class office buildings that are being opened in our downtowns. And the space per attorney is lower by 100 square feet after COVID than it was before. We think law firms are going to have a positive impact on Texas office markets going forward. While many industries are pulling back in terms of the amount of space that they're using, law firm by law firm, they tend to be maintaining their space. And the growth in the industry means that overall that industry will lease more office space in the future than it has in the past. The amount of space that law firms are going to use really depends upon how their employees will interact with that space. There's two terms in commercial real estate that sound pretty similar, but they're actually different. So we can talk about workplace versus workspace. The workplace is how people go into the office, how they move around the office, how they interact with each other, how they do heads down work where they're working alone versus collaborating with other people, whereas the workspace is the physical arrangement of the seats, the conference rooms, the boardrooms, where all of that different activity takes place. The way a company uses its space, its workplace policies and culture influences the amount and types of workspace that it needs. The legal industry has historically been fairly conservative in the way it's set up their offices. But over time, different types of firms have started exploring new ways of using workspace. In some cases, like many office users, law firms began to move towards more open settings. One of the challenges in legal work is that there's a lot of confidentiality involved, and the culture within law firms is based on things like access to private offices, assistants, and so forth, and those tend to require more closed, traditional spaces. Now, many small firms have stayed with the pattern of one office per attorney, maybe senior attorneys having larger offices, but what's happened nationally, not just in Texas, is that most of the large law firms have adopted, for instance, single-size offices. They may be using a pool of talent for their support work, and that talent may be located in an entirely different city from the attorneys. So we see law firms of different types and of different sizes really trying out a lot of different ways of using office space, both to improve their productivity and to try to improve their ability to recruit talent. Another reason that we're seeing law firms use space differently is that the mix of jobs within law firms has been changing over time. And that has to do with changes in technology and changes in just how they do their work. So for instance, if we look at the most important or the positions that are most common in law firms, say before COVID versus today, many of those positions, the top ones, they're the same. So say the top 10 positions attorneys, legal secretaries, business managers, they're all still in the top 10, but almost all of those job categories account for a smaller percentage. So what that means is that law firms are adding other types of talent. It may be technical talent, it may be marketing people, it may be graphic design people, or other types of positions, because they're dealing with a different client mix, or because they're focused on their business development. So that different type of position may need a little bit different type of office space. So this analysis uses a lot of comparisons of law firms today versus before COVID, but we really want to emphasize that COVID is not the only thing that's driving these changes. Law firms have been adopting technology for many years that has changed the number and types of employees that they hire. For instance, something that seems very simple, the adoption of personal computers, many years ago, and new attorneys coming out of school that were comfortable typing their own materials meant that law firms didn't need as many secretaries or paralegals to do work. A more recent adoption of technology would be electronic discovery, where something like an artificial intelligence or a software program can scan through thousands or even millions of emails or other documents and identify the ones that the attorney should pay the most attention to. And that means that a lot of firms don't need as many of the low-level attorneys or entry-level attorneys that used to, scour through all those paper documents manually. So the legal industry in Texas is growing in general. There are some markets, in particular some smaller markets, that aren't growing very fast, or maybe you're actually losing some legal employment. But in general, what we've seen is that the faster a metropolitan area grows, the faster its legal employment grows. Though we've seen that the legal industry in Texas is growing faster than the overall economy, law firms are at a little bit lower concentration in Texas than they are nationally. And so that may imply that we have fewer attorneys in Texas than in other parts of the country. We think that reflects the fact that government centers, older commercial hubs, so places like Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, they still have a disproportionate number of major law firms and major attorneys. But what we will probably see in the coming years is that more and more of that activity will move to Texas as Texas cities become the leading business centers in the country. There are only 3 of our 25 metropolitan areas that have a higher than national average concentration of legal activity. That's Austin, the state capital, and then a couple of our energy-focused cities, Houston and Corpus Christi. Law firms are a little bit different than some of the other professional service industries like engineers or accountants or marketing firms. And that's because a lot of the activity or a lot of the transactions that lawyers do, they rely on the court system. And courthouses are still in our downtowns. Many of their clients, the jails are still in the central cities. Many corporate headquarters are still in central cities. So law firms tend to still be focused in our major downtowns, and at least that's true for the big law firms. For 2 reasons, again, because of access to the court system, but then also access to the high prestige buildings that law firms like to be in. Those tend to be big downtown towers. Law firms have long been an anchor for Texas office markets. Given the growth in that industry, we expect that to be true for many years to come.